Thank you. Welcome to this event, which is hosted by the Centre for Identities and Social Justice. Anna Traianu is unfortunately unable to be here, and she's been one of the main instigators in organising this event and also supporting Steve Dixon Smith through his time at Goldsmiths. And I'm the head of the Centre for Language, Culture and Learning, and so I'm really pleased to bring these two centres together for this event. I'm really excited to be about to listen to Steve Dixon Smith as well, and his exciting research. I've seen it at very different stages along the research journey, so I'm really pleased to be listening to it now. It's completed successfully. I'm going to hand over to our head of department, Fazana Shane, to introduce Steve Dixon Smith for the event. Thanks, Fazana.
Thanks, Vicky, and a very warm welcome to everyone. I've been asked to introduce Steve by Anna, who sends her apologies today. So Steve, I'll introduce you shortly, but just to say that we speak for about 50 minutes after we've done the introduction, and then we'll open up for questions. So Steve completed his ESRC funded PhD in March 2024. His study was a response to institutional framings of inequality encountered in his work supporting inclusive learning and teaching in higher education. During his PhD, he wrote 2 book chapters and co-authored a policy paper on ethnic categorization for the Higher Education Race Action Group, a paper that's been very well cited and has done really well. So his chapter, Making a Mess of Whiteness, Subversion and Reproduction of Racialized Academic Space, is due to be published in the journal Subverting Space and Race Toward a Geopolitically Conscious and Anti-Racist Sociology of Language in 2025. That's a book, is it? It's not a journal, it's a book. Apologies for that. Steve takes a critical sociolinguistic approach to analyse how whiteness and structural inequalities around race and class are reproduced and resisted in higher education. So I will hand over to Steve to present his talk, and feel free to post your questions in the chat.
Okay. Thanks, Fazana, for the generous introduction, and thanks everybody for making the time. I know for lots of you in difficult circumstances to attend, and thanks for having me here in across the centres. It's great to be to have the opportunity to come and talk to you about the thesis. I'm going to present some analysis and findings from the thesis, which was a linguistic ethnographic account of race and class in an undergraduate architecture studio at my place of work, which was an arts university in the south of England. But I wanted to also begin with some context around how and why I ended up here researching these issues. I've been working in HE, higher education, on supporting inclusive learning and assessment for a number of years across different contexts. And I was kind of motivated by the idea that education can and should bring about social change. Being white and the first person in my family to go to university, kind of university never really felt like my space or education more generally to begin with, and I guess I initially sort of saw this through a lens of class, and during my work, a colleague presented me with the figures of what was then called a BME white attainment gap, and these showed at our institution and other institutions this kind of consistent and persistent difference of around 20% in the awarding of 2-1 and first degrees. And this I was in my mid-30s at the time, mid to late 30s, and for the first time I'd been sort of presented with my own role in reproducing racial inequalities. So we kind of saw this situation that universities were reproducing racial inequalities, and that I was somehow part of that. And I raised this with the head of School of Architecture at the time, who I was working with, and he said to me, Steve, I don't need to see the I don't need to see the figures really. I know just through looking at the students who come in and the students who leave that the cohorts, they get smaller and whiter over the 3 years of the course, and this is definitely true in architectural education as a whole and within the university. And it reflects some pretty striking kind of inequalities of racial inequalities within that area. So we set up some small scale institutional studies and did some work on institutional initiatives and committees and working groups and this kind of work within the institution. And as I became more involved in that, I kind of came across these policy constructions really of race and class, and I'm just going to talk through a little bit of where I encountered them in this sort of middle section that you can see on the slide there, in the sort of Hefke era. But I was wondering where these things came from, and the obligation on universities to monitor for ethnicity and for ethnicity and attainment in this way came out of initially the Race Relations Amendment Act in 2000, which was the sort of legislative response to the Macpherson report, into the way that the CPS and the police have dealt with the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, and so they were designed to monitor for institutional racism. Slightly earlier, there were efforts from within the new Labour government at the time to widen participation in education, but they were kind of class focused and had a kind of colourblind orientation, as Pilkington puts it. So moving forward to when I encountered them in around this time, there was a Hefke, the Higher Education Funding Council for England, who were responsible for equality research at that time, published these accounts, these statistical measures of differences in outcomes among students, and they called these things the categories used for monitoring student characteristics. So this is just an illustration really of the type of thinking that I could see sort of leaking in both to initiatives that were happening within the sector, but also within policy, within these sort of wider policies. It says differences in outcomes in the title, the effect of student characteristics. So that places the cause. That means the cause of the differences are the student characteristics, and the student characteristics are these statistical measures of what started out as institutional racism monitoring. So you see this sort of slippage occurring, and I argue in the thesis that even within this framing, class is treated as structural, as educational disadvantage that relates to, postcode participation in local areas according to postcode, whereas race is dealt with as kind of discrimination on the basis of ethnic categories that attach to individuals. So there's a difference in the way that things were treated there, and I'll touch on that a little bit later when I come to some of the later slides. But by the time the study had finished, there was a different take on these measures, and the reporting of race and class separately was actually used in a Johnson government sort of commissioned commission on racial and ethnic disparities, which was known as the Sewell Report, and they used the separate classification of race and class in education as a kind of way of saying, well, it's not race, it's class, and to deny to sort of put forward this post-racial discourse that denying structural and institutional racism, as Tickley and Paul Warmington have pointed out. And the OFS discourse on this was, so the OFS took over responsibility for these issues after Hefke. The OFS emphasised a discourse of choice and agency here to resolve the problem. Bizarrely, they talk about schools as the place where this needs to be addressed, but then at the same time say there is no gap in schooling, and also they do address it where they do address attainment gaps. This is class focused rather than looking at issues around racial inequality, and that's despite the fact that the figures for class show a 50% smaller gap than that of the black-white awarding gap. So these two quotes have really stood out through the process to me as representing what I came across. The idea from Brett St. Louis that these discourses reify people of colour as racial others who are the embodiment of social problems, and Bhopal and Pitkin's argument that they construct racialized minorities as problems to be managed and contained. So with this in mind, I turn to kind of anti-essentialist framings of race and ethnicity and class. And I'd in my previous studies, I'd looked at social theory and I'd come across Stuart Hall's work on the discursive construction of identities and the death of the essentialized Black subject, and also in linguistics, that these ideas taken up by Ben Rampton and others, Roxy Harris, around race and ethnicity constructed in everyday talk in classrooms, in studies in education, and these kind of ideas of identity and as emergent and relational and interactionally constructed in discourse, I found these in critical sociolinguistic studies, and so I formulated my PhD proposal around kind of identity construction and this sort of anti-essentialist response to policy constructions. These kinds of approaches, though, have been criticised recently in critical sociolinguistics as presenting race as kind of flexible and fascinating and fictional, and privileging the interests and experiences of white scholars like me. So I'm quite keen that my approach isn't doing that, and somehow does manage to combine the structural with the anti-essentialist. And there is more recent work in sociolinguistics which is focused much more on the structural, from Ian Cushing and Julia Snell. And they've focused on the structures and institutions within who sort of dictate language policy, rather than the construction of identity. And they look at perception of language rather than and ideologies around language, rather than the actual production of it. And that's something I tried to take up too. So obviously whiteness, although it's kind of something that's relatively recently being dealt with in critical sociolinguistics, has a longer history in sociology of education. Kalman Bhopal talks about the relationship actually between whiteness and middle class identity as the privileged position in the academy. Nicola Rollock also talks about the way that, and others also talk about the way that class is always shaped by and informed by whiteness, even when a whiteness isn't explicitly named in educational settings. And Dave Gilbourne talks about the fact that if we want to do serious critical work on intersectionality, we need to account for how the categories and inequalities intersect, and through what processes and with what impacts. So what I wanted to do in the study was to understand, well, how is higher education white? What are the processes through which the structures of race and class are constructed and reconstructed in interactions within the institution? My research questions were here, were the ones here. What are the discursive conditions in which race, class, and ethnicity are negotiated in the first year architecture studio? And then what are the discursive processes and the strategies through which people negotiate subject positions in interactions and in narrative accounts? How do these relate to material conditions of inequality? And how do these discursive processes interconnect with broader social orders in ways that relate to inequality? So trying to bring both the structural and an anti-essentialist approach through. The methodology that I take is linguistic ethnography, and that means I was sort of brought to this because of the fact that it's about unpicking taken for granted assumptions about groups and categories. And there are two key principles, really: that the context for communication should be investigated ethnographically rather than just assumed, and also that meaning is always far more than just the expression of ideas. Biography, identification, stance, and nuance are extensively signaled in the linguistic fine grain. So we need to be looking at the sort of close linguistic work. We need to do close linguistic work to understand what's going on in interactions in terms of meaning. And I hope to share some of that with you very soon. But first, a kind of imposing looking triangle that's stayed with me, I think, the course of the PhD, and has been sort of added to throughout. So at the top is the kind of data that I collected. So I collected interactional data, narrative accounts through interviews. The interactional data was participants, and there were four key participants making self-made audio recordings in the studio and in social settings. This is while they were working on tasks in the studio, as you'll see. There were in-depth interviews with participants and on their prior educational journey, and reflections on their interactions over the year. And the course coordinator became a key aspect of the study, and there was an interview with him, and one of the chapters is devoted to the way that he constructs, the way that he produces the environment in which the students work. I started with 8 key participants and ended up with 4 due to the quantity of data, but within that 4 there was one white student, one student of Indian heritage, one of Nigerian heritage, and one of Chinese heritage, or British students. And so what I wanted to understand was, what are the processes of identity construction and interaction? And to do that, I use this sociolinguistic concept of indexicality, which is really sort of the way that we point to things outside of the interaction through the interaction. So often, and we'll see in the case of the analysis that I look at here, the pragmatic, in the interaction motivations might be something like making somebody laugh, or for example, and then the meta-pragmatic level that comes into that is the bringing in of social, broader social constructions into the immediate interactional context. So in this case, we'll see some sort of teasing around ethnicity. And so these larger categories and these broader social categories, macro social categories, and these interactional motivations are sort of part of a dialectic process in which meaning is produced. And that's what I try to look at. And within that, there are obviously orders of differentiation that go on. Okay, so what's valid and recognizable in this setting if somebody wants to position someone, let's say, in terms of their ethnicity, what's a valid positioning, what's not a valid positioning. The reason for doing this is to look at what structures are navigated in the studio. So I'm looking at the way that colonial distinctions between whiteness and non-whiteness are re-articulated, and also focusing on perceptions through these sorts of evaluative centers of which I'll explain more about in the process, so that the focus isn't on the individual speaking practices, but on the ideological processes that are being relied on to make these things happen at a pragmatic level. And all of this is sort of anchored in Stuart Hall's articulation. So Stuart Hall defines articulation in lots of ways, actually, but in a sense here, he says that it's both a way of understanding how ideological elements come under certain conditions to cohere together with a discourse, and a way of asking how they come or don't come to be articulated at specific conjunctures to certain political subjects. A little bit more on that, because that really kind of, that idea of articulation requires attention to historical specificity, which was central to the study. So Hall says, and this is why I anchor the study in Hall's articulation, that race and class are discursively constructed, but they're discursively constructed in material conditions of a historically produced present. So not just any old thing can be discursively constructed. Racism cannot be explained in the abstract or without its articulation with other social relations in specific historical conditions. So what are those historical conditions in England in terms of race and class? When Hall was writing about articulation back in 1980, he said that these hadn't been written yet. We didn't have these accounts at this point, these historical accounts. But since then, Satnam Verdi and Robbie Chilliam have produced these historical accounts of the way that race and class have been mutually constituted through British and English history, and in the service of white elites. So in Chilliam's terms, class is race. There is no politics of class that is not already racialized, and so he sees whiteness as a position of dominance in a racialized order of class relations, and that's the way that I understand whiteness in the study. So it's always about class and race, and Chilliam's argument centers around the idea that the logics of a hardworking, orderly, independent, white English genus that's central to both the racialization of the undeserving poor and to colonial oppression. And he shows how this happens throughout history. There's also attention to this idea of little platoons, which in conservative thinking of Edmund Burke, you've got this idea that there are kind of lots of small related centers of power where or small patriarchies, which kind of which manage these distinctions, and we'll see how that comes out in the analysis. There's a lot more to say about this, but for the purposes of the analysis that I'm going to share, I think that's enough on the histories of race and class. One thing to add is that the idea of conviviality and multicultural conviviality that Verdi points to actually in his histories of race and class in England as a potential source of hope in difficult times. But this comes from Paul Gilroy's understanding of conviviality and other sort of developments on that within sociology, and the idea of a kind of confident indifference to difference that rejects cultural essentialism. So these were key principles, and to understand how that works at the level of interactions, I used the idea of evaluative centers, and I found three. The findings were that there were three evaluative centers that could be seen throughout the study and applied across interactions. And these were white racial hegemony, self-responsible deservedness, and conviviality. So these are the kinds of authorities which people orient to regarding what is perceived to be valued in the course of interactions. So these evaluative centers can be really small, like you might be the coolest kid in the class, or skate culture, or something slightly broader, or something huge like heteronormative masculinity. And along the way, there are orders of indexicality of people who are more or less aligned to these centers. So in the case of heteronormative masculinity, it might be a deep voice versus a high-pitched voice, might be a way of distinguishing an order of indexicality that points to a kind of heteronormative masculinity that sits outside of an immediate interaction, for example. So some centers obviously are bigger than others and have a greater reach of historicity. So that becomes important when we look at how these interrelate. So onto the data analysis. I'm going to share with you two examples or data from two participants. And the first comes from the interviews and studio interactions of Jasmine, who was a first-year architecture student, 18-year-old woman of Punjabi and Indian heritage, and working class. If we're to take the ways that she would be categorized in the higher education policy, and she was from London. And in her narrative accounts of interaction in the studio, you can see here the interactional map that she was provided with. So I provided a plan, and the participants mapped their interactions across the year on this plan. And she her plan produced this comfort zone. She said there's danger zones and comfort zones within the studio, and you can see that on the slide. Hopefully, this green circle. We're going to hear some interactions from this comfort zone. The rest of the studio she found quite alienating, and she talks of danger zones and comfort zones. She says in the interview, look, at school I was the loudest kid in the class. What am I doing wrong here? And then she talks about the majority of them and the minority of us, and makes when I press her on that, she makes these kind of reluctant distinctions between them, these nerd. She says the best way I can describe it is a kind of nerdy stereotype. Nice people, good students, but when they joke together, like, my jokes are different. They're kind of stronger. And she talks about 3 particular students amongst others, but we're going to hear from each of these in different ways. So Gary, she says, is one of them that I can talk and joke with, just on a surface level. And we're going to hear a bit from Gary's analysis because he was a key participant. But then there was Bobby, who she said, well, Bobby can speak to them and us. And then there's Ricky, who is initially, she thought he was a nerd. He was in the nerdy kind of category, but he's like the twin, that my guy twin. We never knew that. So she really feels quite close to Ricky. She's not known him very long at all, but she feels quite close to him. We're going to hear Bobby and Ricky in the interaction that I'm going to share. And Jasmine felt she had a connection with London students that was established through a little joke, taking the mickey, denoting where you're from, like rough areas. She said Ricky's from London, so he has that. So in the interactions the interactional data that I'm going to share, the participants are Jasmine, Ricky, Bobby. Ricky is male British Filipino heritage. Bobby is male white British. And there's Daniela, who's female white Bulgarian, and Pretty, female Singaporean of Indian heritage, but she was engaged in the surrounding talk, but she doesn't contribute directly. For context, they were working as part of a recently created group on a design task, and they'd only recently been working together. And in the pre-talk, before we hear them, they've been discussing arranged marriage among the group, with Jasmine and Pretty co-constructing an account of different cultural norms around the practice in response to Ricky's questions. And then Bobby is passing by and joins the group. So this is the first part of what is said. I'll give you a minute or two just to read through before I show you the analysis. Okay, so it begins with Bobby, the white student who's passing. Why are you all looking at me? This is rude, just because I'm white. So Bobby, in linguistic terms, he instigates a play frame and makes race an available resource for humor by positioning himself as both white and racialized in this context. Jasmine takes up this play frame even before he's finished the utterance, before he's even finished what he's saying, and she says, "What? It's because you're Sri Lankan." I'm joking, and then Ricky and Bobby carry on this kind of jokey sort of interaction. Until there's a point where Bobby is talking about my half sister, my actual sister, apparently, and Jasmine says, "I'm not Sri Lankan," and then she says again, "I'm not Sri Lankan." Nobody responded first time, and Ricky says, "Yeah, but you're still brown, same difference." So Ricky's recently referred to himself as brown, so there's a kind of in-group legitimation here. They're using essentialism, really, teasing essentialism, indexing racist discourses and ideologies. And he's denying, in a joking way, teasing way, Jasmine's claim to differentiation on the basis that she's not Sri Lankan. And there's work on this in sociolinguistics about the idea of bonding and biting to develop relational identities. So teasing amongst groups to develop closeness, there has to be a bite for the bond to happen. But the bite should be a nip. It shouldn't be too strong. So this is what appears to be going on. There's a tease. They're developing their relational identities, and remembering that Jasmine and Ricky hits it off pretty quickly. But there's also joking about absent others. That is another feature of humour for relational identities, and this is about creating an in-group against an outside group. And we could say that what's happening here is making racists laughable, and there's a literature around this too in sociolinguistics. So these racist ideologies and racists are made laughable, and that's in distinction to the in-group relation development between Jasmine and Ricky. That she's been positioned in this way, Jasmine laughs and says, yeah, I couldn't quite make out what was said next. Bobby talks about being born in India. There's some kind of confusion about who was born where. And Jasmine says, look at him, I was. And we see in the next slide that this is positioning Ricky as brown. She's saying, look at him. I'll leave you for a second to read through what happens next, and then I'll show you the analysis. Okay, so Ricky's response, yeah, but I'm not that part of brown society. You're the, and this is a kind of an attempt at stratification of the group that legitimated the tease. So the in-group that was constructed around brownness is now stratified by Ricky, saying that well, there are different levels to this. I'm not that part. And so Daniela, the white Bulgarian student, asks, well, how are you brown? And Ricky just responds straight away, Filipino. Jasmine has loud laughter. That's so rude, laughing, loud laughter. Oh my God, she's squealing. And she's pointing out a transgression. This is unlegitimated. Daniela isn't part of the in-group. There's potential here for white perceptions to be guiding what she's saying, and that the object of ridicule is no longer necessarily exclusory racializing discourse, but subjects racialized as brown. Ricky doesn't seem to notice anything. So he says, wait, did I say something wrong? Jasmine says, no. Daniela says, well, Daniela says, I did. And so Jasmine responds, she did. She's like, how are you brown? She's laughing still. And she's pointing this out to Ricky. Ricky's response is to say equators and that, isn't it? So he's extended now the idea of his brownness as being this kind of Filipino stratified, different from that brown society, to a description that incorporates Jasmine. And Jasmine affirms this with this idea of a phenotypical difference, so, and uses we. So we can deal with the sun, we. and Ricky affirms this, yeah. So and then Ricky's laughing. He says, "Oh man, Bobby," and it seems like somebody's remembered there's a recording going on, and Jasmine says, "I feel so horrible because we're all laughing." So this is a light-hearted, convivial interaction, but within it, there's a lot of management of what is acceptable within these evaluative centers. So we've got the pragmatic work going on that's bonding in an unfamiliar place, making each other laugh. And then we've got these evaluative centers of conviviality, a confident indifference to difference, which is being shown by the fact we can call each other brown here and it's kind of okay. Versus this white racial hegemony, there's a chance that it's precarious. There's a chance that things could be understood wrongly here, and that Daniela might see things the wrong way, or that. But also there's a precariousness within the studio. This is a place of comfort as against a place of danger for Jasmine, and this is where they get to be able to challenge some of those racializing perceptions amongst themselves. So this is could be argued to be jocular mockery. These strong jokes that Jasmine refers to, discursive practices that are rooted in material conditions that she talks about in rough areas of London. She talks about stabbings at her school. She emphasizes this in her narratives. And there's a kind of stance of toughness where we can do this, we can take the mickey out of each other, and that's fine. And Pia Pitchler has noted this similarly in young schoolgirls of Indian heritage in East London too. And this is class to negotiate race, but race to negotiate class. The two are not distinguishable in that way. They're working off each other and together to make the thing work. But at a pragmatic level, what we have going on here is colonial distinctions, rearticulation of those, and conflict paradigms of difference that are being reworked through conviviality and the joking. Okay, this is the next set of analysis, and this comes from Gary, who was a key participant. I'm going to look at some of his interviews and his interaction. Again, a pseudonym. The students chose their own pseudonyms. He's 18 years old. He's a man. He's white, British, and middle class by the standards of equality monitoring because of his parents' occupation and the fact that we're university educated. Okay, so in the narrative accounts, we can see again the interactional map. Gary is sitting just to the right of the middle at the bottom, and you can see around Gary that these are all the interactions that the people that he interacts regularly with, and you can see lots of them pass through Gary. You can also see in this green line that goes around the edges, this is the zone which people frequent. And for Gary, he's drawn the whole studio. So he's saying that he's got access to the whole studio. Everything goes through him. In the way that he narrates the studio, he says there's a big fucking competition going on. I think ours might be the most dominant group because we're always in. We're right in the center with quite a mass of us outside. If you look across the groups, there's like a class system of people participating in the design process, being active and giving commands. And then he says the grunts get work that they can't mess up. So the grunts is a military term for like cannon fodder. So the grunts get the work they can't mess up. He says it sounds horrible because we're downgrading them to mere workers, not kind of cohort people of our cohort. And this is where in the thesis, I analyze in much more detail, obviously, that looking at the way that this is sort of brings through this idea of little platoons of people organizing across the studio, giving commands, making like small patriarchies that are associated in Schilliam's account of race and class in England with whiteness. And so looking at the studio interactions, there are 3 participants in this one. We've got Gary, male white British, Henry, male white Canadian, and Joshua, who is present but not participating. So for context, another group work exercise, they're designing a space for differently socially located guests, for example, a fisherman, a surgeon, a refugee, and the participants can be heard by surrounding students. In the pre-talk, there's a conversation initiated by Joshua, who's passing and joins the group. And he's suggested the exercise is stupid, it's not worth doing, it's about a political standpoint. And in response, Gary says that, well, it's about developing stereotypes. So I'm going to leave you to read through this transcript very, very quickly for a minute. Okay, so in this interaction, there's Gary is questioning Henry about the person that he's designing for. They each had to design for a particular person, socially defined. One of them was a single parent, and there's some kind of joking around that, a kind of eccentric humor, if you like. And analysing this, I looked to Mary Buchholz's study, a sociolinguistic study in the US, where she looked at the white students in a multi-ethnic context, similarly to the multi-ethnic context of the studio, and she said that they. And she found that they aligned with a kind of intelligent nonconformist identity, which sort of they termed nerds. And this included precisely enunciated speech style, which we're not going to look at here, excessive formality, which we can see if we look at Gary's. This is very typical, because very typically instead of usually, a mother instead of mum or mom. And language evoking the registers of scholarship and science, and this is used in everyday speech. That's what makes it different and indexical for Buchholz, pointing to indexical of extreme whiteness in this context. So this idea that of evoking registers of scholarship and science. So we can see this multi-clause, almost legalistic language. This is an exercise about stereotype, and I would be stereotyping. The mother usually decides to keep the child. A stance of objectivity, and then followed up by a departure from that, which suggests more of an opinionated, colloquial sort of framing that we can attribute more directly to Gary. So that's the form of this sort of zany, eccentric, and objectionable humor. Okay, so after a short break, they go back to their work, and they come back to this idea. Henry's single parent again brings it up, and it gets reworked again into some kind of for them humorous practice. Now, if we take the idea of the single mother, why the single mother here? Why is it generating this kind of response? Well, Beverly Skeggs has written about how the single mother is a stigmatized symbol of working class amorality associated, and Shilliam writes about how this is associated with family breakdown and the blackening of the undeserving working class. And he quotes David Cameron in the aftermath of the 2011 uprisings following the shooting of unarmed black man Mark Duggan in Tottenham. Cameron said, irresponsibility, selfishness, behaving as if your choices have no consequences, children without fathers, schools without discipline, reward without effort, crime without punishment, rights without responsibilities, communities without control. And this is what Shilliam talks about as this kind of like he's concerned about the loss of these small patriarchies, but we can see here how the figure of the single mother is constructing, in the case of the interaction, a kind of joking about an absent other again. But the absent other is constructing the in-group as different to them, in distinction to, and in distinction to the single mother. But also we can see the idea that what if her crying overwhelms the whole table, and we can see a similarity here with the thinking around what if these amoral, undeserving, disorderly people upset the fabric of the nation. So in Cameron's framing, so we can see here at a pragmatic level, again, we've got some in-group bonding in an unfamiliar place. They're trying to make each other laugh, but they're using this joking about the absent other to do that. And through these evaluative centers of self-responsible deservedness. So we saw in the narrative accounts how Gary constructs that against the undeserving people who don't even, shouldn't even be working on the projects. And we can see in the use of the superstandard and the nonconformist humor this sort of alignment with an extreme whiteness. So you can see both of these evaluative centers in operation here to navigate hegemonically white perceptions in the studio. And what I mean by that is it's part of their everyday social calculations, just things that just go on in the studio. But to do that, there's a reference to the meta-pragmatic in this idea of the black and disorderly, undeserving poor, as Shilliam would put it. So to conclude briefly, contrary to the meritocratic discourses that emphasize choice and agency that we've seen more recently in policy constructions, racialized students face unequal socio-linguistic burdens just in their everyday navigation of these historically produced discursive structures. And this requires an orientation to racially hegemonic evaluative center, reproducing material conditions of disadvantage. So race and class in higher education institutions articulate in structural ways through whiteness, and they can't be passed out at the point of the individual as they are in these kinds of constructions where we try to say that it's not race, it's class. Conviviality amidst racism, while operating at a lower scale, does offer some hope by providing emergent spaces and relations that disrupt colonial logics. The question is, how can these be upscaled? And I've left a link down there to the full thesis if you want to explore that further. So thank you everybody for your time, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you